And so with one of my students, Laura Bermario, who's been actually a key person in a lot of this work, we've recently written a review of the literature on attachment and anxiety to evaluate these ideas. That review suggested that the strongest evidence is really for a link between secure attachment and low levels of anxiety. That seems to be pretty well shown across a number of studies using a variety of methods to assess both attachment and anxiety. Are certain children at risk for anxiety, certain insecure children? That I would say is still an open question, because there are some findings that suggest that children with ambivalent attachments are more likely to form anxiety, or more likely to have anxiety problems, but that's not really completely consistent. So you can find studies where it was the avoidant kids in the insecure group who had high rates of anxiety, not ambivalent. And then the other thing that makes this whole question a little hard to evaluate is, as I mentioned, studying disorganization is a more recent trend in the literature. And now that people are beginning to separate out and look at kids who are disorganized, people have begun to question whether it's really disorganization rather than the other insecure patterns that might be linked to anxiety. And it's really rarely been studied. There's only one published study, and then the work that I'm going to tell you about today is not yet published, that's really looked at disorganization. So we don't actually know too much about whether disorganization might really be the risk factor for the development of anxiety. So that was sort of reviewing linkages between parent-child relationships and various kinds of anxiety symptoms. I didn't really differentiate out yet social anxiety, but just to comment on that, you know, again, social anxiety having to do with anxiety around others, you might even think that of all the anxiety disorders, perhaps social anxiety would even be particularly related to parent-child relationships. And you know, you might think that for a number of reasons. So as I mentioned before, parent-child relationships are this context for learning social and emotional skills. They may function as a base for exploring the world, not just doing cognitive exploration, but social exploration as well. There could also be sort of a motivational base. They could function as a motivational base in the sense that if you have had positive interactions with your caregivers, you found this relationship rewarding, that may lead to some expectation developing that in general social interactions are going to be rewarding and may make you less hesitant to engage others and reach out to others. And finally, it's also possible that self-concept is important as well. So in the context of particular kinds of parent-child relationships where parents are accepting, children form secure attachments, we would expect children might develop an enhanced sense of self-confidence, higher self-esteem, which may also facilitate them reaching out to others in social interaction. Now, in terms of the empirical evidence, there's actually a much smaller number of studies. When you start to look at those that look specifically at social anxiety instead of other aspects of anxiety or global anxiety symptomatology, there are a smaller number of studies. I put up a few examples here. What these studies do tend to suggest, though, consistent with what I've told you so far, is that measures of parental acceptance and parental control are linked to social anxiety, as is secure attachment. So when parents are more accepting, sorry, I'm going to say it the other way. When they're less accepting, more controlling, and children are less securely attached, they're prone to higher levels of social anxiety. And again, we don't really have a clear picture for insecure attachment. There's really there's really just a couple of studies. And in terms of ambivalent attachment, for example, one study found an effect, one didn't. And there's only one study of disorganized attachment. So we don't really have a lot of evidence one way or the other about whether particular insecure patterns function as risks, specific risks for social anxiety. Okay, so I've sort of reviewed and shown you evidence that parent-child relationships are related to the development of anxiety symptomatology in children. I want to mention a couple of the other things that in sort of reviewing the literature that we noticed and that really affected our own thinking about the question of what we need to study next about parent-child relationships and anxiety. Here's a couple of things. Many of the studies that have looked at parent-child relationships and anxiety have looked at parent-child relationships sort of in isolation. So there are studies in which the whole goal was to document parent-child relationships related to anxiety, but they weren't looked at in the context of other risk factors. And so this raises a number of questions regarding whether parent-child relationships, there's some sort of a unique influence there. Are they explaining something about the development of anxiety symptomatology that would not be explained by other kinds of known risk factors? Because as I said at the beginning, of course, parent-child relationships are only one of the risk factors for the development of anxiety problems. So in the studies I'm going to present to you today, part of what we're trying to do is look at whether parent-child relationships explain individual differences in anxiety symptomatology, controlling for some other known risk factors. Do they add anything? And then the second direction that we've been taking is to ask about what might be the mediating mechanisms, or do we need mediating mechanisms even to explain this link? Is it really that, for example, being securely attached, does that in and of itself make a child less likely to be anxious? Or do we have to explain that link by pulling in other factors that may mediate it? That is that more of an indirect link, so maybe these parent-child relationships influence particular characteristics of the child, such as emotion regulation, and it's really the emotion regulation difficulties that are more proximally explaining differences in anxiety. So I'm going to be talking about these two questions and illustrating them in a recent study that we did. And in this study, looking at parent-child relationships, and I'm going to tell you about some data specifically on social anxiety. We were looking at social anxiety symptoms in 10 to 12-year-old children. And I think that's kind of an interesting age to look at social anxiety for a couple of reasons. One is if you look at the epidemiological data on the incidence of social anxiety disorder. What you see is that social anxiety disorder starts to rise around age 10. It starts to rise in incidence and continues rising until about mid-adolescence when it levels off a bit. And so we're sort of studying these kids who are toward the beginning of this, where there's this trajectory, this rise in social anxiety symptoms. And we know there's just a lot of social factors going on in pre-adolescence, pre-relationships becoming more important, and maybe that's even, Heidi's would probably argue that's part of what's going on here as well. Difficulties in peer relationships at that time might also contribute to this heightened social anxiety. So we were interested in this 10 to 12 age period, and in this study we've used different kinds of methods. You'll see, so for example, the data on parenting that I'm going to present today is all observational coding of parent-child interaction. We used an interview to assess attachment. We have the child reporting anxiety symptoms. I know there's a whole debate about who should really tell you about the child and whether the child is anxious. We don't have a clinical interview here, it's questionnaire data, but we tend to focus on what the child is telling us rather than the parent, just because we're sort of thinking the child is going to have a better sense about their internalizing symptoms, some of which they may mask and which may be harder to observe. Even though I can tell you that our child reports and are correlated very modestly with mother report. And finally, we also have a mother report of behavioral inhibition in this work, a questionnaire. Okay, so in this study I'm telling you about, we had 87 families that participated with their mothers. They were recruited from schools and clinics. A little interesting note about the sample, because oftentimes when you recruit primarily from a community, you're thinking, am I going to really get kids with anxiety? Well, almost all of the families are from the community. Very few were actually recruited through clinics, and I think we had as many or more kids with various kinds of disorders in the community sample. And actually we have quite a few kids who meet cutoffs on our anxiety measure. So actually it is pretty diverse in terms of anxiety symptomatology, in case you're wondering about that.